Hello everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Brittany Bodane, and I'm excited to be here today for our Terrain Analysis with Surfer webinar. Today we'll cover how to convert elevation to slope on a grid file. We'll cover watershed maps, viewshed maps, and the brand new peaks and depression maps, which is found in Surfer Beta. After the discussion of each topic, I'll stop for a few minutes to answer any questions. You can send your questions to the webinar host via the Q&A button located on the Zoom toolbar at any time. Please type in your question. It will be sent to the webinar host, who will either answer it or forward it to me. Please use the Q&A function rather than the chat. This will allow our host to see all the questions and answer them or forward them to me in a timely manner. Feel free to send in all of your questions. If we don't have time to answer them during the webinar, we'll answer them via email once the webinar is complete. This webinar is also being recorded. Later this week, I will post the recording on our support portal along with the data used in the webinar, and I'll send each of you a link when it's posted so you can test the examples out yourself. So let's get started. Our first example today, we'll talk about watershed maps and converting elevation to slope. A watershed is defined as a region draining into a stream system, or body of water. A watershed map reads the data from a grid file and splits the grid up into basin or catchment areas. Because this map type reads data from a grid file, we'll need a grid to create this map type. Surfer supports many grid file formats, such as ASC, which is commonly used in ArcMap, or another example would be DM, which is commonly used by USGS and a ton of other resources you might find data. And of course, if you don't have a grid, you could instead create one with XYZ coordinates listed in a text file. And for that, you would use the home grid data command. Today, we'll be working with an ASC grid file of Yellowstone National Park. The grid I have is in terms of elevation, so we'll go ahead and convert it to slope. And the way that we convert it to slope is by clicking Grids, Calculate, Calculus. Surfer really does all of the work for us here. We just have to input our grid and select the function we'd like. So if our grid was open, we could click None, but we haven't opened anything yet, so I'll click Browse to navigate to my grid file. To find the slope option, we'll expand Terrain Modeling and select Terrain Slope. Terrain slope calculates the slope at any grid node on the surface and is reported in degrees from 0, which is horizontal, to 90, which is vertical. For a particular point on the surface, the terrain slope is based on the direction of the steepest descent or ascent at that point. Grid Calculus creates an entirely new grid, so I'm going to go ahead and give my new grid a name. And then we see at the bottom we have the option to add our grid as a layer to a new map, and we can choose any of the grid-based map types. So I'll choose Watershed and click OK. So our grid is created, and Surfer used the grid to open up a watershed map. There's a lot going on with this map type, especially with the settings we have on it now. So let's take a deeper look at exactly what we're looking at here. I'll select the watershed layer in the contents, and we can see all of the properties for this map type on the General tab. First, we have the Depressions section. Depressions are areas of internal drainage, such as a sink. Depressions can be forced to overfill so that water continues to move across the surface. And Surfer forces this overfill when the Fill Depressions Pits option is checked, and this is checked by default. So if we uncheck it, we can see when Surfer isn't forcing the depressions to overfill, this is our watershed area. And again, sorry about that. Just making sure everything's working right now. Okay, looks like we're good. Our host was just, okay, perfect. Our host was saying it kind of froze for a second, so I want to make sure you guys were all with me. Okay, so with the fill and depressions pits checked, we'll see this entire area because Surfer is forcing the pits to overfill. When this option is checked, you can save the filled grid to a file. So clicking Save to File will allow us to export a new grid of our filled areas. Below this, we have the Streams option. We can choose to show the streams, and the streams are, of course, the blue lines we're seeing. Streams show the path water will take across the grid and mark the low points on the map. Stream paths are calculated based on the amount of flow into the grid node from all surrounding grid nodes. Streams start when the number of upstream grid cells draining into a grid cell exceed the specified threshold value. And the threshold value is shown here. The higher the threshold, the fewer streams and depressions will be present. So ours is, as you can see by the slider, we're at our smallest level here. So just for example, if I increase this number, we get a more generalized map with wider areas showing. You can, of course, change the line properties of your streams if you don't want them to be blue. And then for our basin options, of course, you always have complete control over the colors Surfer's using. We can choose a new color map, or if we click these three dots for custom color map, which we'll do a little bit later on in the webinar, you can you have a lot more control over the colors showing. The last option we see on the General tab is for the pour point source. The pour points are the outlets of the stream systems and are calculated at all drainage intersections and where the drainage leaves the edge of the grid. The pour points can be generated automatically or selected from a file. We can see the options here. So the file type you would need would be a BLN file, which is a proprietary file type. Essentially, it's the coordinates of your data points listed in a worksheet with a couple extra things to tell Surfer what kind of object it's looking at. We have a bunch of information on our support portal. If you'd like to be pointed to this, you can go to our support.goldensoftware.com and search for BLN. So we can see here if we change it to none, our pour point source goes away and we only see our streamlines. We can get a lot of information out of the watershed, but it can also be helpful to overlay another layer, just to give us a little bit more context on what we're looking at. We could use the same grid file to add another grid-based map type, such as a contour map or a 3D surface, or we can add an image as a base layer to our map. For our purposes today, I'll show you how we can download a map from within Surfer. When downloading a base map, you can add it directly to your map as a layer, And if you have a coordinate system assigned to your map object and your layer, as we do here, shown as on our coordinate system tab in the properties, Surfer will actually download the base map using the limits of our existing map. So that makes it a little bit easier for you. You don't have to know the exact coordinates you need to find the base map. So to download a base map, I'll select Map and click Home, Add to Map, Layer, Base from Server. These servers are really nice. We have a bunch in here already. As a note though, we aren't in control of the server, so if you're ever trying to use one and it can't connect, it's probably just down for a little bit and it'll be back. You can try again later. We're going to take a look at this USGS 3-depth elevation. And I'm going to select this hillshade multi-directional. And as I was mentioning, Surfer is immediately able to locate where we're working. What we'll download is inside this yellow frame. And you might notice that specify longitude, latitude is toggled, and we are working in UTM. As long as the coordinate system is assigned to the map, Surfer can convert the coordinate system of a layer to the coordinate system of the map object. So it does all the work for us again, just making it easy. As long as it knows what coordinate system we're working in, Surfer can convert it for us. So I'll click OK to download our image. The image is just slightly bigger than the limits of our grid. So I can click yes and it would expand our limits a tiny bit, or I can click no to leave them as they are. And if I select our watershed, I can turn the opacity on it down a little bit so we can see the imagery through. And you can see that this shading gives a nice effect with um, being able to kind of view what the basin looks like, how steep it is, etc. You could create the same type of effect if we had used this same grid to open it as a color relief. And if you're curious what this looks like, I'll just turn off our watershed for a minute so you can take a look. Next, we'll take a look at the Viewshed map, but before we move on, do we have any questions? So we do have some questions. Can you create a watershed map directly from elevation data without the slope step? Yes, you can definitely create the watershed map directly from elevation data without the slope step. But I do find a lot of users like to work with slope, so I want to show an example of how you can convert your grid to slope. The rest of our examples will be working with elevation. But yes, we could have directly created the watershed without the slope step. And then we have another question. Are the cells based on the map dimensions and or RF? I'm not really sure what RF is, but these cells are, the watershed is using the grid file to create this. So it's looking at the Z values in the grid file and looking at the Z values next to the grid file to determine whether the slope is going up or down. So I hope that answered your question. If not, give us a few more details about that. Okay, and one more question. Can you download grids from Surfer like you can with base maps? Yes, you can. You can download grids using the grids, new grid, grid from server command. So you can get a lot from directly within Surfer. And of course, you can use data that you didn't download from Surfer. For example, the original grid that we created the slope from was downloaded from, I think, a USGS website. Can you download Google Earth images from Surfer? Google Earth has a server, but it requires some like special permissions to set up. Our support team's not very familiar with how that's done, but they do have information. Google has information on their support site about how you can use their server in other applications. So if you did want to directly set up that server within Surfer, you should be able to with that information. Otherwise, you can, of course, always get an image from Google Earth or anywhere else and georeference it in Surfer if you needed to. Very easy to georeference in Surfer, and we have a bunch of information on our support portal about that if you need help with georeferencing. Okay, thanks for your questions. If you still have some, send them on in. I'm going to move on to talk about viewshed maps. So for the viewshed map, I'm going to switch us to using our elevation grid. Because we have this map open already with our other grid, I can actually click the General tab with the layer selected and click this Open button next to Grid File and just replace the grid we're using. There we go. So we replaced the grid we're using here. So now we're using the original elevation, and you'll see the watershed didn't change too much when we switched those values. Um, so yeah, you can definitely create a watershed without the slope. Now we'll move on to the viewshed. The viewshed analysis indicates which grid cells are visible from an observer or transmitter's location. Since the viewshed requires a grid and a transmitter location, the viewshed analysis must be added to a map object that already contains a 2D grid layer. So for example, a contour map or our watershed is a 2D grid layer. So we can go ahead and add our viewshed to this map. I'll do so by clicking Map in the Contents and then clicking Home, Add to Map Layer. Adding a layer to an existing map is different than creating a map from using the buttons in the New Map section, because adding a layer will allow Surfer to look at the coordinates of each layer and overlay them using the coordinates. These maps, when they're in one map object, all the layers are spatially tied to one another, whereas if we just created a new map, it would not be spatially tied. And of course, for the viewshed in particular, as I just mentioned, it has to be added to the map as a layer that contains a grid. So I'll click Viewshed, and you'll see my mouse immediately change to crosshairs. This is so I can choose where we're going to place the transmitter. I'll just click on the map to place it, and Surfer's generating our viewshed. The viewshed is calculated by casting a ray from the transmitter position to each grid node. Starting at the transmitter position, a point is sampled at each sampling distance along the ray, and visibility is determined. So if I select our viewshed layer in the Contents and click the General tab in the Properties, you'll see the sampling distance is listed right here. The sampling distance can be changed by typing in a new value right here. A small sampling distance value increases the viewshed accuracy, but also increases the time to create the viewshed. Below our sampling distance, we have the option to view visible areas or invisible areas. So if I switch it, we can see Surfer is going to give us the inverse highlighted, and we'll be able to see instead, we'll be highlighting the areas that are not visible from our point. And again, if I increase our sampling distance, it'd speed up our time a little bit here. So just back to visible areas. While it is calculating that, we talk about the transmitter position. You can type in XY coordinates for the transmitter position. If you had a specific point that you needed, you could just click on the map anywhere and then enter the XY values you need. This allows you to be really accurate, definitely more accurate than my just plunking down a point wherever looked good to me. Oop. And below this is the view. In the view, we have the option to change the radius, start angle, and sweep angle. So the radius is by default equal to the diagonal of the grid extents. So by default, the entire grid is included in our viewshed analysis. We could, of course, change this if you didn't want the entire grid to be included in the viewshed analysis. We could decrease this radius. The start angle specifies the starting direction for the viewshed analysis. It can go from 0 to 360, where 0 or 360 is east, 90 is north, 180 is west, and 270 is south. So I'll just go ahead and change our start angle so we can see what that does for us. We'll see the most change when we adjust the sweep angle. The sweep angle controls which portion of the map is included in the viewshed analysis. The viewshed analysis begins at the start angle and continues radially for the number of degrees specified by the sweep angle. The sweep angle can vary from negative 360 to 360 degrees. Positive values sweep in a counterclockwise direction, and negative values sweep in a counterclockwise direction. So here we've changed our start angle, and if I change our sweep angle, you can see our area changed quite a bit. I'm just going to change it again so we can see what that looks like. And we'll talk about the height above surface, but before we do that, let's take a closer look at these areas we can see. I'm just going to open up Surfer's 3D view by selecting the map in the contents, clicking the View tab in the Properties, and clicking 3D View. So here we can really see what we're looking at here, and this is Yellowstone National Park, so these mountains are pretty sheer and interesting looking. But here we can see our viewshed area, and we can see the watershed overlaid on it here. I'm going to come back to our plot and turn off our watershed. So it's a little bit easier to just view our area that we can see. And right now with the watershed turned off, we are seeing the grid we're using. And then overlaid on that is the hillshade image that we downloaded. So that's what we're looking at right now. So you can see what areas you'd be able to see in the 3D view especially. So selecting our viewshed again, we can look at the height above surface values. So we have the ability to change the height for the transmitter, receiver, and the ability to add a height to account for obstructions or vegetation. So again, the transmitter, that's where our view is starting from. So often, but not always, a taller observation point generates a larger viewshed. Not all the time, of course, depending on what's in the way. But most of the time you'll get a larger viewshed with increasing the height of the transmitter. The receiver height is the height above the surface that is evaluated at each grid node. The default value is 0, as we can see here. So this means the grid cells are visible when the surface is visible from the transmitter. This value can be increased to represent structures, for example, a 150-foot tall power line or a 10-meter tall building. And these values for height above surface are going to be in the units of your data. My X, Y's in meters and my elevations in meters as well. So these values are going to be in meters. So we can just take a look at what happens if we make our receiver height, we'll make it 3 meters. We can see our viewshed area increased. We come back to our 3D view, it's updated as well. The obstructions vegetation height is added to the surface between the transmitter and receiver during the viewshed calculations. The transmitter and receiver heights change the slope of the line of sight. The obstructions vegetation height affects the likelihood of a sample point obstructing the line of sight, rendering the receiver grid node invisible to the viewshed analysis. And as this implies, it is most often used to simulate vegetation, buildings, or any other obstruction. And of course, the default value for this is 0 as well. So we can see how our viewshed changes when we enter an obstruction height of 1 meter. And it didn't change it too much. If we change this to put it above our receiver, you can see we're basically going to see nothing there. And then we can actually make this map a little more interesting since we're not using our watershed layer anymore. I'm going to convert this layer to a contour map. A contour map would be a little bit more interesting with the data we're looking at. So I can convert this to a contour map instead of adding a layer as a contour map and deleting my watershed layer by just selecting the watershed and clicking Map Tools, Layer Tools, Convert Layer. And right now my contours layer is using the same color scale as the watershed. And the watershed was in terms of 0 to 1. So I'll select my contour map and click I'll click Levels. And next to our fill colors, we'll click Custom Color Map. This is what lets us have the most control over our settings here. And I'll click Use Data Limits. This is what I was saying, our watershed was a min and max of 1. And then it applies it here. We'll click OK. Now we can take a look again in our 3D view. We can see it looks a little more interesting with that contour layer overlaid with it. The converting the layer is a pretty new feature, I think, in Surfer 19. It's pretty nifty, definitely speeds up workflows. Okay, and that covers our section on the Viewshed map. Next, we'll take a look at the peaks and depressions map. Before we do that, do we have any questions on anything we've covered so far? Can the transmitter be moved after the map is created? We can't pick up and drag the transmitter to move it, but of course there is the option to type in a new XY value. If you didn't want to create a new map and you just wanted a new XY value, you could, I guess, pretty quickly get the value by using the map tools, layer tools, digitize, and then copy and paste these values into the XY. So that would allow you to move it. Or you could, of course, add another layer, and you can have multiple viewshed layers in your map too if you wanted to see where two transmitters might overlap. So you could do that if you want. You can have a bunch of different layers in here. Okay, if you have any more questions, send those in. Is there a capability to model an overhang? So Surfer's just looking at XYZ values. So an overhang would have stacked Z values, so it wouldn't show that very well. It would need to be able to read the Z values in multiple layers. We are working on adding this capability to Surfer, so we'll add your vote to all of the tickets we have that will help make that happen. And we are really good at contacting our users if we have added a feature you've requested. So we'll let you know if that's available. And we do hope to make Surfer's 3D view really robust so you would be able to look at things like that in the 3D view. Thanks for your question. Okay, one more, and it's just about the 3D view in general. I noticed there is a water option on the 3D view. What does that do? And that is, user saw this, when you have environment selected in the contents, water is listed on our general tab. This just allows you to add a flat plane of water, and you can control what level it is. So you can kind of see, what areas would be filled at various Z levels. And of course, as with anything else, this is in the units of our data. So we're looking at meters. Okay, well, we will just move on. I'm not seeing any more questions. If you have any, please send them in. So for our third and final example, we're going to look at the brand new map type in Surfer Beta, the Peaks and Depressions map. Beta is available to use for free if you have active software maintenance. You can download that from your My Account portal. And if you're not a fan of using beta applications, we get it. So just sit tight and it'll be in the next version of Surfer, which is coming out soon. But let's take a look at it so you can see why you'd want to use this map type. So we can create a new map or the peaks and depressions by clicking Home, New Map, Specialty, and choosing Peaks and Depressions. I'm just going to convert my Viewshed layer to the peaks and depressions instead. And there we have it. So I'll turn off our contour map so we don't have as much going on, even though I do think it looks pretty neat. So here we can see our peaks and depressions. Our peaks are in red and the depressions are in blue by default. This layer type uses the grid file to identify peaks and depressions by drawing a polygon around these areas. This is a closed contour where drainage flows away from it, which is a peak, or into it, which is a depression. Some of you might be wondering how this varies from using a standard contour map and using hatchers, which we can see in our options in here. We have the option to fill in hatchers for this contour map. So it is different from using the contour map for a few reasons, which will become clear as I continue to explain about this. So main difference between using the closed contour hatchers on a contour map and this peaks and depressions map is that we have split up the peaks and depressions so they each have their own properties. They have the same properties, but you can control them for each. So if we click the peaks tab in the properties, we have the ability to turn off showing the peaks. So now we're only seeing depressions. And same with depressions, we can only view peaks if we'd like. Of course, the ability to change the look of it. You could even load in a file if you wanted. In the maximum section, we are able to turn on the show marker. And this is showing us the maximum point on the peaks. And if we make these a little smaller and zoom in, we can see that we're seeing the maxima point of each peak polygon. And we can do the same thing for the depressions. It'll show us the maximum point. We could turn on a label, and this shows us the z-values. Our labels are gigantic right now, so you could turn the size down, change the positioning and all that on that to make it a little more readable. Probably a little more helpful if you have less peaks and depressions than we're looking at in this file. And then, of course, at the bottom, we have the ability to show hatchers. We can have them point uphill or downhill. And we can even change the line properties if you wanted to make your blue hatchers blue or your depression hatchers blue so they match the other blue. This can be done. And same for the peaks. Can change the opacity on them so when they overlap, as in the case right here, you can see through them and see that there are depressions in this peak area. And then we can, of course, view this map in the 3D view as well. So we can really see how Surfer is identifying our peaks and depressions a little bit better. I'm going to turn off our hatchers for the time being so it's a little bit cleaner. Can also turn our contours back on and see how that looks with our contours as well. So really highlighting our peaks and depressions and having that fade of the contour. So brand new map type in Surfer Beta, soon to be in the full version of Surfer as well. Pretty straightforward, but very helpful if you're trying to highlight some peaks and depressions, especially if you're working with karst topography and other applications similar to that. So that concludes our presentation for today. If you have questions, send those in and I will get those answered before we shut this down. Can you run a cross section at a specific elevation? You can easily create a profile. So I'll show you how to do that right now. We just need to have our map selected. So map, and then we can click map tools, add to map profile. And if we say we want to see maybe from this peak, I'm going to click, and you'll notice my mouse turned into a crosshair again to show that we're drawing our polygon line. And I'll put it over to this one, and I'll double click, and as soon as I double click, Surfer shows us our profile. So Surfer will create a profile for each layer you have in your map. Our layers are all the same. They all have the same Z values because we're using the same grid. So we won't see that. But if you had overlaid a couple grids and they had different Z values, you'd get to see a profile for each one in the profile. And you can turn those off if you, each layer off if you need to. But Surfer does allow you to very easily create that profile and update colors and everything about it. And of course, the distance is in the same data units as our grid, which is meters. Oh, and I actually forgot to show you guys one thing. Another cool thing about the peaks and depressions map is we can, are the features on our general tab. So we can do all local highs or a minimum, maximum, low, and then we have the option to create a report. It takes Surfer a minute or two to create this report due to all the peaks and depressions we have. So I saved my report, but this is what a report would look like. First, we see statistics for all of the peaks, and you can see how many peaks we have. So this is statistics for all the peaks together, all the depressions together, and then listed below are statistics for each individual peak. And if I scrolled down really far, we'd see a section of individual depressions and all the statistics for those. So you can get a ton of information out of the peaks and depression map that you can't get out of any other map type or any other report that Surfer offers. This is just specific to the peaks and depressions map. Okay, we have another question. Is it possible to filter the peaks and depressions based on a particular size threshold? Not right now, but that would be a great improvement for this map type. And we'll be sure to add your vote for that and let you know if we are able to include that in a future version. I agree, though, that would be really, really helpful to be able to isolate that out. You probably could create a grid that kind of had some of those thresholds in it. But off the top of my head, I don't have a good workflow for you. But we'll be sure to add your vote for that. And how are the peaks and depressions calculated and shaded? I'll have to get back to you via email on that to see if I can get you some of the resources we have and references that are used for our calculations. So I'll follow up with you via email on that one. Okay, well, keep sending questions if you have them. I don't see any new ones coming in right now, but thanks again for joining. And again, if you're excited about using the peaks and depressions map type, go ahead and make sure your software maintenance is active because that's what gives you access to beta, or keep your software maintenance active and sit tight. We will be releasing a new version of Surfer soon. So thanks for joining. If you think of any other questions, feel free to email them to surfersupport@goldensoftware.com. Have a great day. I'll send each of you a link to the recording and the data used.